Hi, this is Dr. Erica Lewis. I'm recording this lecture on prototyping and testing. This is not really a comprehensive lecture, more of a just-in-time teaching lecture where I'm trying to cover the things that I think will be most useful or the things that folks have reached out to me with questions about. So it's really not meant to cover all of the ideas from the text that you're reading, but to kind of supplement those ideas. So we're in the prototyping and testing phase of design thinking, and prototyping involves creating increasingly sophisticated interactive visuals or experiences for people to interact with and give you feedback. And testing includes gathering feedback of these increasingly sophisticated prototypes that you're doing. So just like anything, but since we're talking about design thinking, any phase of the design thinking process, it's possible to prototype and test and really get no value out of it. You could kind of check this box and not have it be useful. And that's true of really most skills in life, and even those skills that can be game-changing. Like other skills, prototyping and testing takes practice, and that's part of why we're actually doing this exercise instead of just reading about it. But we're going to focus on what's distinct about prototyping and testing as compared to other skills you have and what you can take away from that and what you should be practicing as you're out there doing this these next couple weeks. The reason you prototype is to get a better test. Research shows that when people have something to interact with, they are able to give much better feedback. And that's especially true early on in the process of creating something. You want to prototype early for that reason, but also it allows you to get testing of a product or an idea before you get too wedded to the idea. And I hope this really came through loud and clear in the Creative Confidence book. If you spend a whole semester developing one prototype, by the end of that semester, you would be pretty set on that being a cool thing. Even if you don't want to, that's just what happens in our brains. But if you spend a weekend and made a quick prototype, which is essentially what you're going to do here for your first iteration before you make a more sophisticated prototype of a solution. If you spend a little bit of time on a prototype and you find out your plan is bad, well, that's a huge success because you haven't implemented something and spent a lot of time on something that wasn't going to work. Or even if you just find out that aspects of that plan or idea needed changing to improve, that's a really important thing to learn early on before you get too wedded to the idea. So prototyping early is unique to design thinking, and it's something that's this prototype and test early is unique to design thinking, and it's something that's different than many other QI process that we use in healthcare. So you have to understand and work from the assumption that people will be eager to tell you your prototype's good. So you have to focus on the fact that you're testing the prototype, not the person. You're not asking them lots of questions about whether they can, use it. You're watching them use it. You're looking at the prototype. You're there to test the prototype. So think back to examples from the Thanks for the Feedback text about pooling feedback. And that's what you want to do in your interviews that use your prototype. And then also think back to Creativity Inc., where they built that whole lounge because they kind of went around and asked people first. They were like, oh, would it be a good idea? Do you like this? And people are like, yeah. So if you ask questions like in that way, that's not a useful test of an idea. So if they had instead, I think the Creativity Inc. author pointed out, like if they had instead made like a mini little bar up there, maybe a lemonade stand type thing, and had a sign that said free drinks and tested whether anybody came up, that would have been much more productive to see if does anybody actually use this than to go around and just say, hey, what do you think of this idea? Most people, when you ask them, what do you think of this idea, especially if it takes no expense on their part or no buy-in, are going to say, yeah, that's fine. But you want to get at ideas that are beyond that are better than that. And that's one of the value addeds of prototyping in design thinking. It helps you to do that. So if everyone is telling you your prototype is great, you're asking the wrong interview questions or the wrong people, and you have to dig a little further. You really want folks to interact with your prototype. And I know some of you are stressing about how that would look with a process prototype. So I'm going to talk about some prototypes as examples here in future slides. Ask lots of questions. So insist that they tell you something that's wrong with it. Just say, if anything, just one thing is wrong with it. What is it? Ask them what would be more valuable than this prototype. Say, well, you could have this, but what else would be more important to you? Or if they could only keep one feature about this prototype, what would it be as you move forward? And then you never want to rely on just one person's ideas. You want it to be a collection of ideas. And that's one thing we're trying to simulate a little bit here in this process, because you and your team members are talking to multiple people in your interviews. If you were rolling this out in a larger way, you would want to talk to more people than what we're able to throughout this kind of smaller process. So in doing a full design thinking, cycle, if faculty were to pick up one of your ideas, we would test this with more people moving forward. So you also want to change your mindset as you move into this. You should absolutely feel more confident if you have prototypes fail along the way, or aspects of your prototype that fail along the way, than if you begin with an idea and it never evolves during your prototyping and testing phase. That's a real mindset shift in mindset. If you go into it thinking like, I've got to make changes here for this to be good for these people, that's going to lead you to a better testing of your prototype. So I'm going to show you a few little examples and just tell you some stories here too. This was created by a undergraduate team who was tasked with working on food insecurity. And they initially thought that food access was a problem, but they started talking to people and doing their interviews, and they found that actually people in Harrisonburg have a lot of access to food. Some of the places mentioned were these food pantries that you see here, and so people really felt like they were able to access food in our town. But one thing they learned through their interviews was that people were not able to, they didn't know how to take the food they got and use that to create something healthy. And food security isn't just about having enough food, but it's about getting adequate nutrients out of that food that you have, and having adequate nutrients in your life. So this group created these recipe cards, and they did a whole bunch of them. This is just one example. I think they did 3 ultimately. They had some early prototypes, but they did these recipe cards. And on these recipe cards, the front had the recipe, and they used ingredients that they worked with the food pantry to learn were common at the food pantry. And then the backside included explanations about the food groups and how the ingredients fit into the food groups to help people to not just use the food in a more nutritious way, but also to understand what was going into that, so that hopefully that would build that skill in their lives. So in the prototyping and testing phase, this is these folks' second prototype. They created these cards, and they distributed 13 cards at one food pantry and 12 at the other. And they had a QR code on each card that allowed folks who pick these up with the distributed food to say whether they used it and what they liked about it, what they would improve, and give some feedback on what they found to be helpful and not about this. Now, if I was giving these folks feedback, I think these stats are great. I'm not sure that this got at the level of critique that could have helped them to kind of iterate this prototype further. But I do think they had done a lot of that early on, and so they were really ready for this kind of, more survey type feedback of their prototype. And this ended up going on to be implemented at the food pantries that they worked with. So that was a pretty cool solution that they developed over a couple weeks that I think is making a difference for folks. So these students were a group of undergrads. They included computer science and engineering and nursing. And they had access to some materials that you all won't because of that interdisciplinary nature of their team. But they did a design sprint and were targeting college students who were experiencing overdose on a campus. And this was some time ago, maybe 8 years ago. So you actually, these things are actually available now, but they weren't at the time, which tells me that they were onto a pretty cool idea. When they did interviews, they found out that people didn't have access to naloxone spray, which is what was being distributed at that time on campuses, but it was hard to access at that time. I think it's much more readily accessible now. And so they developed these boxes kind of similar to an AED box that could be opened in an emergency and placed around campus and opened in an emergency. And you can't see all the details, but when the box opened, it activated emergency response. And then when the box was opened, there was this prototype of a spray inside that talked you through how to use that for someone who was unresponsive in the situation. And you can't see it, but here in the middle, they had a video file that, or an audio file, excuse me, that when you clicked on it, they would actually talk you through how to use the spray. So they did that as part of their prototype. They made a audio file. So part of the reason I wanted you to see this is that they have this hands-on interactive nature of their prototype, but most of the people that they needed to get feedback from were never going to actually interact with their prototype, kind of similar to you all. So they had to create a slide similar to this that explain their process and that help people to get a sense of it by listening to that audio file, even when they couldn't touch the prototype. So this is a really good example, in my opinion, of a low fidelity kind of process prototype that could be used, something similar to what you all could do. And you could create a product, something to hold in your hand that was, interactable like this that people could see. All right. So those are just a few examples. I just now want to kind of get to some of the questions people have been having about design thinking, about where we're at, and about how to use this, leverage it moving forward. So design thinking, and honestly, if we're being honest, most research is messy like this. Looks like this squiggly line and not like this kind of clear line that we often portray research to look like. But design thinking is explicitly like this. It's very messy at the beginning when you're doing the research. It becomes more refined as you get your concept and prototype. And ultimately, the idea is to have a very, have one design that makes sense based on all of that work. So taking you back then to the empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test phase. Right now we're in the prototyping and test phase, but I just wanted to mention again that, design thinking is not linear. So we're consistently returning to empathizing. As you're going through your most recent interviews, you should be adding things to your problem list, and you should be adding potential solutions to your brainstorming list. If something comes up during an interview you're having that you think would be a valuable addition, that should get put on that list. So even though we have this one problem we've kind of defined, we still have this overall goal of understanding that problem better. And that's part of what the value added you'll be giving to the DNP faculty as you leave this process, is that understanding the problem. So you still want to be adding to those. And now we're doing prototyping and testing to hopefully get to a pretty sophisticated prototype that's been tested towards the end of these 4 weeks that we're in right now. So I just want to give some examples of how design thinking might be used in combination with other process. I know you have so many tools that you're learning and tools that you use in your practice that it can start to feel a little overwhelming. And I've said before that as the problems you're working on become increasingly complex, you're working at the doctoral level, you need multiple tools. But it's also helpful to see how those tools can kind of fit together and work together. So one way, I've seen design thinking used several ways. One way is, before an evidence-based project, design thinking could be used as one way to gather evidence, similar to an addition to the literature review. So gathering evidence using both of these methods, which one is inductive and the other includes much more deduction, you can get stronger evidence for a project. So that would be one way that could be done before an evidence-based project was implemented. Another way this could be added into a traditional kind of nursing process, it would be to complete the iterative design thinking process as a project begins. And then as the ideas become more sophisticated, moving towards traditional QI or research methods as the testing. And this is the way that I would say historically design thinking has been implemented in business and healthcare, that it begins as this using the design thinking process, and then once the prototype becomes sophisticated enough, then the shift comes where you use more traditional kind of QI or research methods. However, even no matter where you interface with another method, you can use principles of design thinking to inform aspects of the QI or research process. So just to give an example of this, let's say that you wanted to do a QI process, but you wanted design thinking principles to inform it. Maybe in traditional QI, and I'm oversimplifying this, a team would make a plan using the IHI questions. They would involve a planning team. The plan would be implemented on a small-ish level, maybe one unit. Data are gathered. Most often those are quantitative data to decide if the plan had worked, and then think about moving forward. So that's kind of, in my brief summarization, how a traditional PDSA QA process might unfold. A design thinking informed QA process, the planning process would involve thinking about all of the stakeholders who would be affected by the change, and at very least, doing some interviews of those stakeholders to gain their perspective of the challenge. And then the implementation would occur in the smallest, most low fidelity way possible first. So as opposed to traditional QI where there would be a lot of planning, there might be a really small, kind of easy way of testing the ideas before the iteration came to be more sophisticated. Maybe this would look like, I don't know, let's say you have a new falls plan, taking it out and getting a diagram of it and showing that diagram to patients, or setting up one room and having a few families walk through that room with the new implementation and giving some feedback to what that felt like. And then the studying phase of the QI process would involve not just looking at the quantitative data, but also asking some stakeholders how they perceive the change to be. And there would be a more explicit focus on figuring out the parts that didn't work, instead of just looking at, let's just say one fall measure to see if it improved or didn't. It would be looking at that measure, but also asking stakeholders, did this present any new problems for you as we implemented this? To find out what aspects of the problem didn't work as well. So there's lots of ways that design thinking can be used independently or interact with traditional healthcare research and QI methods, and we're going to keep talking about this. I know some of you have been percolating on this and asking me questions about it, so I wanted to make sure to get it out there because you're thinking about it. All right, as always, let me know what questions you have.